quote, "It seems evident by the beginning of the 10th century BC, blacksmiths were intentionally stealing iron. A carburized iron knife dating to the 12th century BC is known to Cyprus. In addition to this, a site on Mount Eder in northern Israel has yielded an iron pick in association with 12th century pottery." The scholar writing on this says, "One would hesitate to remove a sample from the pick for analysis, but it has been possible to test the tip for hardness, and the readings average 38 on what we call C scale of hardness. This reading is characteristic of modern hardened steel. Quenching and tempering methods of stealing iron used anciently were also known in the Mediterranean to blacksmiths there during the same period as early as the first millennium BC. Archaeologists recently discovered and tempered carburized iron sword near Jericho. The sword, which has a bronze haft or handle, was 1 meter long and dates to the time of King Josiah. Would have been a contemporary. Herschel Shanks recently described the find as spectacular, since it is, quote, "the only complete sword of its size and type from this period yet discovered in Israel." It's 1 meter long. This is the only ones that big that they found. Such discoveries lend greater sense of historicity to Nephi's passing comment in the Book of Mormon. What about the idea of writing Hebrew texts in Egyptian? The Book of Mormon indicates that it was written using Egyptian characters called by Moroni Reformed Egyptian, though the Nephites also knew Hebrew. "Nephi made a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. Evidently, the plates of brass also employed Egyptian characters, for King Benjamin informed his son that without a knowledge of Egyptian, Lehi would not have been able to read them." Beginning with the publication of the first anti-Mormon work or book in 1834, down to the writings of contemporary critics, Book of Mormon skeptics have scoffed at the idea that Lehi, a faithful Israelite, would be familiar with and even write sometimes in Egyptian. Yesterday, John Dean talked about the broader cultural influence of Egypt in Lehi's day before. The statement here, though, concerns the actual use of Egyptian scripts in being used by Hebrews. One recent critic, actually a couple, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, states, "Since the Bible makes it clear that the Jews had once lived in Egypt and had been made slaves while they were there, they despised the Egyptians. Consequently, faithful Jews certainly would not want their scriptures to be written in that language." Joseph Smith was apparently oblivious to the problem he created when he spoke of sacred records being written in Egyptian language. While the use of Egyptian scripts by ancient Israelites may seem strange to the modern mind, there are examples of the practice from the ancient Near East. Recent discoveries provided evidence that at least some ancient Israelite scribes were, like Nephi scribes, acquainted with both languages. First, a number of Northwest Semitic texts are included in Egyptian magical papyri. These are mostly incantations that, instead of being translated, were merely transcribed in Egyptian hieratic. The underlying language is the Northwest Semitic tongue, an early form of Hebrew and Canaanite. The texts include the London Magical Papyrus, 14th century BC, the Harris Magical Papyrus, 13th century BC, and the Papyrus Anastasi, 13th century BC, and there are several others. The later date of the latter, this is Ostracon 25759 Recto. The latter dates to the early 11th century BC, the time of Israel's judges. While the Semitic text appears on one side of this document, the Verso has a text that is pure Egyptian, but whether there is a connection between the two is unknown. In any event, it is clear that some Egyptian scribes were sufficiently versed in the Northwest Semitic tongue that they were able to translate it using their own writing system. Closer to Lehi's time are Israelite documents from the 9th to 6th centuries BC, from which we learn that Israelites adopted the Egyptian hieratic numerals and mingled them with Hebrew text. More important, however, are Hebrew and Aramaic texts, languages used by the Jews of Lehi's time that are written in Egyptian characters. One of these is Papyrus Amber 63, a document written in Egyptian Demotic and dating to the 2nd century BC. The document had, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, been preserved in an earthen jar and was discovered in Thebes, Egypt, during the second half of the 19th century. For years, Egyptologists struggled with the text but could make no sense of it. The letters were clear, but they did not form intelligible words. In 1944, Raymond Bowman at the University of Chicago realized that while the script, that's the letters, were Egyptian, the underlying language was Aramaic. Bowman managed to translate portions of the text, but it did not become the object of serious study until the 1980s. Among the writings included in the religious text is a version of Psalms 20, 2 through 6. Here then they have a Bible passage in its Aramaic translation, written in late Egyptian characters. In 1965, during excavations at the southern Judean site of Arad, a number of ostraca were found. Most of the documents were written in Hebrew and dated to 598-587 BC. One, however, dating to the 7th century BC, was written in Egyptian Arabic. Here then was evidence that Egyptian writing was known in an Israelite city. This was not surprising, for Egyptian documents from an earlier time had been discovered at the Phoenician Lebanese city of Byblos. More significant, however, was an ostracon. These are little pottery shards, uncovered at Arad in 1967. Dating toward the end of the 7th century BC, it reflects usage from shortly before 600 BC, the time of Lehi. The text on the ostracon is written in a combination of Egyptian Heradic and Hebrew characters that can be read entirely as Egyptian. Of the 17 words in the text, 10 are written in Heradic and 7 in Hebrew. However, all of the words written in Hebrew have meaning in Egyptian, while one of them, which occurs twice, has the same meaning in both Egyptian and Hebrew. The text of the ostracon is integral rather than bilingual. Yegan, who translated and studied the text, wrote, quote, "The two scripts provide supplementary information. They are intermingled. One cannot, however, be sure how the scribe who wrote the text read it, whether in Hebrew throughout, pronouncing all the apparent Heradic signs in their Hebrew equivalents, or in a mixed sort of jargon giving Egyptian values to Heradic signs. One thing, however, is certain. The scribe who wrote the text knew both Hebrew and Egyptian writing systems and commingled them in a single text. Perhaps this is what Nephi meant when he said the language of his record consisted of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians." Additional evidence for the commingling of Hebrew and Egyptian scripts was discovered during archaeological excavations at Tel Em-Kereba, biblical Kadesh Barnea, in the Sinai Peninsula during the latter half of the 1970s. Several ostraca of the 6th and 7th century BC were uncovered. One ostracon, written mostly in Heradic characters, comprises a column of Egyptian measures and 5 columns of numbers, along with the Egyptian. The Hebrew word alafim, thousands, appears twice, with the Heradic 10 in the numeral 10,000, while the Hebrew symbol for shekel, a weight measure, appears 22 times. Because of the order of the numerals in each column, it may be a scribal practice in writing numbers. A second ostracon, 3 vertical columns of numbers, what it contains. The left-hand column has the Hebrew word gerah, the smaller unit of Hebrew measure. After each Heradic numeral, because the numerals are in order, Rudolf Cohen, the archaeologist who discovered the text, concludes that, quote, "This writing is a scribal exercise." This view is supported by the discovery at the same site of a small ostracon with several Hebrew letters in alphabetic order, evidently a practice text. So at both Arad and Kadesh Barnea, there were, in addition to the combination text discussed, other ostraca written entirely in either Hebrew or Egyptian Heradic. The implication is clear. Scribes or students contemporary or nearly contemporary with Lehi in Palestine were being trained in both Hebrew and Egyptian writing systems. The use of Egyptian script by Lehi's descendants now becomes not only plausible, but perfectly reasonable in light of the archaeological discoveries made more than a century after Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. I'll spend a little bit more time on that one because that is a very frequent criticism of the Book of Mormon that you can see in the literature today. In his abridgment of the Nephite Chronicle, Mormon reported that about 46 BC, shortly before the time of Christ, a group of Nephites migrated to the land northward. He stated the people who went forth became exceedingly expert in the working of cement. Therefore, they did build houses of cement in which they did dwell. In 1929, President Heber J. Grant recalled, "When I was a young man, another doctor's degree, ridiculed me for believing in the Book of Mormon. He said he could point out 2 lines in that book. One was